Is Gerard a super bear and highly sought after advisor. He's warning it could happen in the next couple of years. I spoke with him earlier today. Gerard, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
A few months ago, you said Australia had up to a 1 in 3 chance of sliding into recession over the next 18 months. Do you still think that's the case?
Probably not on a 3 or 6 month view. The one indicator I'm watching, I think, stands head and shoulders above everything else is employment. The underlying fundamentals remain weak, but to tip us over the edge from this sort of low growth phase we've been in for 18 months, you really need job losses. And the leading indicators of employment remain quite resilient. They are not particularly far-sighted, so it doesn't rule out recession in 2016, 2017. But if you're talking about the rest of this year, then no, I think the chance of a recession on that timeline is quite slim now.
What's going to support or not support employment?
Well, the big issue for employment going forward and looking to 2017 is firstly the CapEx decline is going to accelerate. We know that from ABS data, but we've known that for a long time just looking at the schedule of big projects. Secondly, we've got the car industry shutting down. That risk that occurred this year has been postponed by some government handouts. Thirdly, it's not clear to me that the residential sector, which has clearly been an important contributor to employment this year, will be able to sustain that growth into next year. And on the other hand, we can't see the offsets coming through yet. Rates are not particularly effective for corporate investment. The currency remains stubbornly high. So I think the risks remain large of coming close to recession in 2016, 2017, but for this year they seem to have fallen away.
So you talk of recession, but what are the actual chances of that happening over the next couple of years?
I'd actually be quite surprised if we avoided recession given the size of the adjustment we have to go through over the next 3 or 4 years. Australia's not ending a once-in-a-generation boom, it's ending a once-in-a-century boom. And the two real facets of that were firstly the rise in the terms of trade. Now, they are already well off their peak and we're heading back towards more normal levels. The second part of it, that in a historical context was even more unprecedented, was the boom in mining-related CapEx. Historically, since World War II, that's averaged about 2 points of GDP. In this cycle, it got to over 7 points, and we're only just starting the decline now. So we will be exceptionally vulnerable for the next 3-4 years as we normalise these measures. I think it will not take much of a shock to tip us over. But as I said before, can I see that shock coming on a 1 or 2 quarter view? Not necessarily. But I think the risks remain very high on a 2 or 3 year view.
The Treasurer has said people who are talking recessions are clowns. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, he would say that, wouldn't he? And that's not to have a shot at Mr. Hockey. It's just to say I can't think of a Treasurer in my entire career of 30 years that have sort of stood up and said, yes, there's a real risk of recession. I mean, policymakers just don't do that. But the bigger issue is when you look at, say, the GDP data we had this week, you can focus on the 0.9 and say that looks fairly good, but you've got to appreciate just how misleading GDP is in this cycle and how misleading it was in the boom. The boom and the threat of a bust is all about the terms of trade. And real GDP at the moment is very low calorie growth. Yes, it's driven by mining export volumes, but the price of this stuff is falling. So our export receipts are actually declining, so it's making no contribution to income. In addition, employment hires almost no one. In fact, they're firing at the moment. So we're not getting any income boost we're not getting jobs growth from it. Statistically adds to real GDP, but it's just not the metric to focus on. And the metric to focus on is domestic income. That remains exceptionally weak, and that keeps alive the risk of recession.
Do you think it would be more helpful if we talked more about recession and more about the dark clouds that are on the horizon?
I think it'd be far better for policymakers to be doing something more proactive about it. I think we're coming close to having exhausted conventional monetary policy, but if the RBA is so concerned about the currency and would like it to come down more, well, don't just sit there. Why not try some intervention? But more concrete is on the fiscal side. We are able to borrow, the government's able to borrow at the lowest rates just about in history. Let's take some of that cheap money and deploy it in growth boosting areas. Certainly infrastructure. I mean, anybody who lives in a major city can come up with a whole heap of infrastructure ideas. Yes, there are problems about the budget further out, but there's plenty, I think, of easy solutions. Easy for an economist to say, not easy politically, but fix up some of the rorts on superannuation, on housing, pensions. These are big ticket items that you could implement and have a huge impact on a 10 or 15 year view.
How long do you think the government will be able to borrow cheaply, given the moves that we've seen in bonds over the past short while?
I think rates are going to stay low for long. Now, that doesn't mean there's no volatility, and clearly we've seen that, particularly in European rates, and that's filtered through to global rate markets. But we are not going back to the sort of rates that we saw 5 or 6 years ago. My own view is I think there are parallels with what we've seen in Japan. Japanese bond yields have been volatile, but historically now for a decade or more, they've been exceptionally low. So I see very little risk of bond yields rising sustainably. Are we in a range and potentially a volatile range? Yes. Are they going back up to the levels that we have historically thought are normal? No.
Looking at rates on a domestic front, do you think the Reserve Bank has done the right thing by cutting to 2%, and do you think they'll cut again?
Well, I guess the problem from the bank's point of view is they have a mandate, they have a lever, and they've had to pull the one lever they felt comfortable using. Now, it would have been helpful for other policy measures to have been deployed, including fiscal policy. Would also have been helpful to introduce some of the macroprudential measures that are now being discussed 4 or 5 years ago, because clearly one of the concerns the bank has about these low rates or cutting them further is the impact on housing and house prices. Now, we could have reduced that risk by introducing more sensible macroprudential measures 5 years ago. That's water under the bridge. I guess we can try and bring them in now. It may be too late.
Do you think there's a housing bubble?
I think housing is a huge macro risk. When we have one of the most levered households in the world with clearly one of the most expensive housing stocks, and what we have seen persistently through the last 2 decades is where you have seen job losses. And of course, they've only been localised because we haven't had a recession in 25 years. But where you've seen job losses, you've seen double-digit house price declines. So if we get job losses across the economy, I'd be staggered if we didn't see double-digit house price declines and all the tensions and stress that that would create. And what have we achieved by letting house prices get this high? Nothing.
You see risks across the economy. What about in equity markets?
I certainly think the Australian equity market will underperform global equities. Now, there's an issue about what global equities will do, but this has been a trend that's been underway now for 3 or 4 years. I think it's going to persist. I think returns will be relatively low, but this is an issue where it is absolutely critical to work out whether we're in this low growth phase, which we've been in now for 2 years and we've had fairly mediocre returns, or if we do tip over the edge into recession. Because the sector that would affect the most, in my view, are the banks and the broader financials. This is not a trivial part of our market. Banks are 30% of the market cap, financials closer to 45%. So if we tip over to recession, you can expect very significant equity losses. But if we just muddle through, I think we'll underperform, it'll be low returns, but it won't be a massive bear market.
Extremely loose monetary policy around the world has distorted asset prices, equities, bonds, etc. How bad will the fallout be for Australia when there's a move, namely by the Fed, to normalise that policy?
Well, look, I think clearly low rates have had an impact on financial markets. It's been one of the problems for policymakers. Low rates, I would argue, have not been particularly effective on the real economy. But they've had their usual potent impact on the financial economy. Financial smarty pants have taken low rates and run with it aggressively. So as we start to withdraw that, I think the areas of real risk are firstly some credit markets. I think equities. We may see some turbulence in bond markets, but my view is bond yields are not abnormally low because of central bank quantitative easing. They are at the new low normal. And that reflects the fact that we just have a world of excess saving. So I think the points of greater vulnerability are equities and credit. That will ripple through to Australia, and there will be some dislocations, I think, but at least here we have a very bank-dominated financial system, less exposed to turbulence in credit markets. If we did get the US dollar going up, then we'd arguably expect the Aussie dollar to come down a little bit. Exactly what the RBA wants, so that's not a problem. But then we'd see the impact on growth. And my view is people will be surprised how little the Fed needs to tighten to have an impact on US growth. And that's partly because we have already seen a tightening in US financial conditions. And that's largely been accomplished through the rise in the currency. They have now had a 10% plus increase in their trade-weighted index. That's probably equivalent already to 100 basis points of tightening. So the Fed will continue a tightening process that's been underway now for over a year. And that will start to have an impact, I think, looking into next year on US growth.
Greece is again in the headlines. Last time we were here, we saw huge volatility on the markets, but not this time around. Is it because markets have become too complacent about it, or does Greece pose not much of a threat anymore?
I think it's a combination. I think Mario Draghi's QE program has to a certain extent anaesthetised investors. There is hope it's ring-fenced, but you'd have to actually see Greece fail to see how strong that ring fencing is. And I mean, the analogue for me is after Bear Stearns was bailed out in 2008, policymakers put everybody on notice that we bailed out Bears because you weren't expecting it. Now that you do expect back failures, we'll let the next one go. And they thought they had telegraphed very well that Lehman's was going under, that it was ring fenced, and guess what? It wasn't. Now, I'm not saying a Greek failure would be as bad as a Lehman's failure was, but I certainly think, I'm not going to take at face value guarantees that there's ring fencing. In particular, even if there's no turbulence on the day, the issue is with the Greek outcome, what signal it sends to the other peripheral economies in Europe that may look at Greece, and the worst case for Europe is Greece leaves and does well. And then you'll have Portugal going, why should we stay in? You'll have the Spanish going, why should we stay in? So you've broken what seems to have been an inviolable bond. If the precedent's set and it ends in not a disaster for Greece, then you could see pressure, political pressure elsewhere for Europe start to fracture. The final point about all this though is the country I worry most about in Europe is France. And France has lost tremendous competitiveness, and ultimately I think the stagnation there threatens a serious crisis in the euro at the core on a 3 or 4 year view.
Gerard Minack, thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome, Elise.